G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic week. Now I started my chemotherapy last night, so I am one round in for this week. Of course I'll take it again tonight, but so far so good. Legends, as always, of course, we have a lot to go over. We will be looking at the maps and comparing maps and seeing where things are changing. But whilst we're on the maps, I want to do a deep dive into Pokrovsk, what the future may hold there, look at some weapon systems being employed in the north, and then reopen Kursk. Of course, we don't see that many changes on Kursk, but we know, of course, it was a massive, massive story last year. So one of my contacts behind the scenes has sent me over how he sees this, and we're going to go over that, where I agree, where I disagree, and open up, I guess, the comments to say, where do you see this as a net positive, net negative, where informational value sits, propaganda value sits, and where attritional warfare doctrine and value and fighting sits in this as well. We need to look at what President Trump has said about wanting access to Ukrainian resources, potentially for then more military aid. We've talked a lot about resources recently, especially around occupied areas. You can go back a couple of videos and have a look at that. So it comes at a very convenient time to talk about this. We do know from Commander-in-Chief Kursk and Zelensky as well, speaking about restructuring the armed forces of Ukraine into more of a core-based system. So we'll talk about that. Of course, what we know is restructuring is going to be very, very difficult. It's difficult anyway, but even more difficult in wartime, especially when you're dealing with a manpower shortage and some units that are nearly empty. But we'll talk about how that may look, and I'll go over as well the structure of the Australian forces and how we restructured in recent memory, at least anyway, and how this may look. Ukraine has continued, though, its large drone strikes overnight. Basically every day there are more drones going into Russia, deep into Russia, hitting oil and gas facilities. And one thing I will say is we had seen peaks and troughs in this targeting over the past couple of years, especially as that longer range drone capacity has increased. And we did see it peaks and troughs when US prices of petroleum products went up and down. Because we know global economies, this whole thing is very, very difficult to manage. And long-term hitting these, yes, it does have an effect on Russia's economy, but short-term can actually increase the price of oil and gas in that global economy and can increase cash flow, but that is short-term. We know President Trump is now in the White House, and with these strikes, and that have had a massive increase since then, either there has been a bit of a tick-off of more of these strikes, or you're better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And so far, we're seeing more and more of this, and last night was no different, with the Astrakhan gas facility hit as well, and reports that processing here of that gas has now stopped. Again, to actually measure the damage at these, because what I'm seeing a lot of people do is they're going, yep, this processed X amount per year, that is now just gone off the top completely. To try and assess the damage of these when you're dealing with a highly flammable substance such as gas, we need to wait for satellite imagery to see what amount of damage has actually been caused here. But those drones, more and more strikes, and will have a longer term effect. And if this war ends at some point in the near future, of course, we'll have that post-war attrition too, and just the money to actually rebuild those facilities or fix those facilities as well. So let's have a look at the maps. Of course, we've got Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv, red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. The red check that you'll see is new ground that Russia is occupying over the last 24 hours. And we're going to be going up and down the map a little bit. But let's start in Chasiv Yar. So we do see some red check in this in the northwestern suburbs, as well as in the south in this forest area. Now we know this is lining up very similar to maps that we have looked at very recently. We'll have a look at Syriac maps here. He's showing in the same general direction, I'll say general direction, in the south here. Of course, further to the west. We know some geolocated footage lines up with this as well. So see where this road turns here? This is this road. So right up into these facilities as well. You can just see the map down in this direction here where it cuts off for himself, but geolocated footage there too, and saying that these blocks, we know there's been bushing, have come under occupation. That's what he is showing as well. Other maps are showing similar. We'll wait out for what becomes in Chasiv Yar. We know this is very, very important. This is why so many resources are being pushed in to defend this or to take this. The high ground here, further movements into deeper into the Donbass, such as Kramatorsk. This is a very, very critical area. So let's move our way north of here, and we'll come up and have a look north of Borova, Oskil, of course, leading into Kupiansk and the northeastern. We see where Russia was able to reach then Kurilivka and cut off the ability to supply north and south in here. And we did know at one point the Russians had pushed down into Zadazove, at least by the Syriac maps. Now, Syriac is saying today, situation northeastern front. During the last 9 days, Ukrainian army recaptured most of Zadazove in a series of positions east of the locality. And I would not be surprised if we see a lot of resources pushed into here to try and unblock this, as it is causing a lot of problems around this Lazova front, just for the length of logistics into here. And of course, forming that southern flank of Kupiansk if there is a larger attack on this area. And we'll push further north. Of course, we see where Russia pushed across its two front lines into Kharkiv toward Lipsy and Vovchansk, and how these did move very quickly initially and then ground down to a halt. Very similar to Kursk that we will speak about a little bit later on. And we know that Vovchansk has been utterly reduced to rubble. Everything from Fab 3000 being dropped in here to TOS thermo barracks and everything in between, moving both ways by block in here too. So let's have a look today, and we just see right in the center a small piece by Syriac map saying it's come under control. The Russian army took control of a series of positions east of Sobona Street towards the Central Park and the House of Culture. Any geolocations in here are very, very hard to do if you can't reference off the waterway running through here, just because of the amount of sheer destruction. But when you have an area like this that is concrete, rubble, and there's bunkers, there's underground areas and dug-in areas, one of the best weapon systems to use for efficiency, at least, if that sounds really poor when you're talking about a weapon of death, but is something thermobaric. The way it can go down into areas and vacuum as well. And we have seen last week, and I'm showing you again, and this is new footage coming out, of Russian TOS thermobaric multiple launch rocket systems being used in and around Pokrovsk. Not Pokrovsk, in and around Vovchansk. We have seen them used in that area as well. So you can see this system here. Now, one thing we have seen very recently, and we have taken note of this, is thermobaric multiple launch rocket systems. We've seen a significant increase in the use of these very recently. We've also seen the Russian Ministry of Defense claiming that the TOS-2 is being used more, which in that, when we have the evidence of it being used, that claim of it, we can say, look, it probably lines up, because the TOS-1, very short range, highly susceptible to things like FPV drones, but we're seeing this used more. What we're not seeing is any footage of TOS systems being taken out. Could it be the TOS-2 is being successfully employed with that longer range in and around 15 kilometers out of the range of some of the FPV drones? The majority will be outside of that range. Therefore, we're seeing few of them taken out, but more of them being employed on the battlefield. And they are a highly efficient but absolute savage weapon. Now, before we go into Kursk, I want to come back down and talk about Pokrovsk, and we have a few things to look at in here. So, of course, what we need to look at, just to line this up, is look at where Minograd is, Pokrovsk, Lysivkia. We have the western flank towards Udashny and the eastern flank around Baranivkia. Of course, we see red check towards Surabini today. This is going to line up when we actually have a look at the Syriac map in here. So we'll have a look at this first. To the south of Minograd, southeast of Pokrovsk, we have a zoom in area here. So just to the west of Krasny Yar, that he's showing that the Russians made a small pocket of ground, but he's also showing a correction, he says, around Lysivkia, south of Minograd. Ukrainian army is still in control over most of Lysivkia and Russian forces control some positions northwest of Novosibirsk, of course, where he shows this red, but that most of Lysivkia is still under control of the Ukrainian armed forces. So correcting his map there. Now, he does show Srebeni. We look on this map and this zoom in sector, it's showing very, very similar all around on this map. We do know Pokrovsk is a very, very important area, central hub. There's a lot running into here, roads, rail, and as well how much this can affect areas all the way to Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, and of course where Russia's ultimate goals here will be of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. So let's have a look over this from Clement Molan, talking about some of the fortified positions in here and what may happen. A bridgehead on the Oskil, an attempt to cross bypass Pokrovsk. So where I've talked about taking the flanks and trying to bypass this rather than an assault. This is what we've seen on many areas recently. But the Russian army continues its slow advance, and the Ukrainian army prepares its fortifications in the Donbass. We're also seeing fortifications being prepared in Dnipro Oblast now too. And a lot of people have pointed out, well, since Velyka Novosilka, there has been a significant reduction in pace on this front. And that is what we're seeing on the maps as well. This is due, though, to many different factors. One, there's been a major assault on a major area, Velyka Novosilka, so the time to regroup, rearm, rest for further attacks as well. You will see a reduction in pace on some close sectors as well, where guys may be moved across to. Some of the Ukrainian forces that managed to escape out of there can also be redeployed onto other areas like this. And I think a major factor is the weather. It has been a fairly warm winter in Ukraine, and I will say, actually, all the winters we've had during this war have been fairly warmer than we have seen previously, or at least historically, in Ukraine. And this has actually been a massive plus for the Ukrainian military and citizens. Of course, everyone uses the energy infrastructure massively, as it hasn't been plunged into the cold of what we have seen in previous winters. But what this has kept is it has kept a lot of mud and a lot of snow melting on the ground, and that is the worst thing for movement. So it can be that too. When we see the weather improve for operations such as colder weather, freezing the ground, or warmer weather, then hardening the ground, we will see an increase in pace of movements on the front line. But we definitely have noted a decrease in pace on these areas. And of course, as Russia push further and further, Ukraine needs to redeploy more and more assets to try and stop this. In early January, I published this map showing the main Ukrainian defense lines towards Pokrovsk. Since then, progress has been minimal, and although the third and fourth lines of defense have been pierced in the westmost part of them, they still hold. So let's have a look here. So this is back from Avdiivka, and this is now Pokrovsk. You can see the Pokrovsk ring of defenses here, but we can see line 3 and 4 have definitely been pierced, and these lines 1, 2 have definitely come under control and have fallen. It was interesting to see how relatively fast these lines did fall, and this has brought into question these other lines and their ability to hold back advances and the challenges being faced there. We can also see the lines, of course, separating the Donetsk and Dnipro Oblast as well. But will Russia look to bypass this or go straight into Pokrovsk? From battles we've seen previously and from what we're seeing set up on the front line, it's looking like a bypass. But will Russia just try and bypass it completely and further lengthen the front line and play into their advantage? Of course, their advantage on the front line at the moment is numerical manpower, just the sheer numbers that they have, and Ukraine have a huge problem with manpower, not only recruiting, but desertion, as well as units that are fairly empty as well. And this is as well from Mr. Molan. From an east-west progression, we now have the possibility of an all-out progression in the form of a mushroom cloud. So this is Chasiv Yar up here. Down in here is, of course, Toretsk, and this is the Pokrovsk front. This is what Moscow is looking for, and it is a strategy that lengthens the front, forcing the defenders to have more men to hold it. And this is what you need to do. You need to play into not only your strengths, but your enemy's weakness. And Russia's strength on the battlefield is manpower. And if they can lengthen the front line, what it does is it thins out the Ukrainian forces even further. By lengthening the front line, it does play into their strength. And this is why, and we're going to look at Kursk now, I've never completely understood the thinking behind Kursk. There's definitely positives in it, but overall, I still hold, since day one to now, that it overall was a net negative because you've played into Russia's hand. Russia's hand is, we have just more men. And Russia down here is looking most likely to lengthen the front line to play into that strength, and Ukraine has given them an ability to lengthen the front line even further and tie up some of their best resources and men in here. But there are definitely some positives in here, and let's look at a somewhat separate opinion to mine. I'll share some bits that I agree with, that I don't agree with, from one of my experts behind the scenes, and you guys can chat about in the comments of what parts I'm right on or wrong on, or what parts he is or not as well. So of course this is Kursk. One thing we are seeing recently is a lot of vehicles, logistics being struck in Sumy by everything from Iskanders down to FPV drones. Mr. Military Summary channel did a very good video on this as well. So this is from one of my anonymous contacts. On Kursk, my opinion is that it was a politically motivated decision and not overly advantageous militarily. It did draw some forces from the east and cause a redeployment. So talking of Russian forces, some of them did move, but we know that a lot of Ukrainian forces got pulled off the east too and moved up as well. However, that was a temporary setback for the Russian war effort, which they have somewhat overcome and continue to grind forward in multiple breaches across the eastern front, and has sped up throughout last year as well. While Ukraine does maintain a pocket in Russia, it loses a comparable size of territory every week or so if you tally all the gains that Russian forces make across the eastern front. Kursk showed that Ukraine could use Western weapons and tactics to good effect, and provided some political wins to showcase to donors and donor states, rather than the continual stream of Telegram videos of donated kit being hunted down by Russian drone teams. And we need to remember that Ukraine is completely reliant on foreign military donations, and that their industrial sector, something that we definitely underestimated, their industrial sector is the informational war to maintain a positive light to get more of those systems and these political wins for donors and donor states. The Ukrainian Armed Forces has maintained the Kursk pocket, and this continues to show Russia doesn't have the capacity to dedicate significant forces to remove it, and that Putin's red lines are not so red. So this is something in which I think is true on the surface, but if we have a look behind, I think I can build an argument to go against this, and I've spoken about this a lot more. Shows that Russia doesn't have the capacity to dedicate significant forces to remove it, but also it may play in Russia's favour to not actually mobilise the forces needed to push the Ukrainian forces back out of here. If we forget, if we for a second just don't think about information, propaganda consequences in here, which we do need to take into for a whole account, but just if we look at it as numbers and figures, attritional warfare, what Ukraine has done is lengthen the front line, that Russia may go, well, they're actually tying up a shitload of resources in here. If we just hold it, do localised attacks and unblock areas, why mobilise at this point in time the resource needed to push their forces back out of here, other than for, political losses? And this is what we look at when we talk about attritional warfare doctrine and the history too. The goal is to force the enemy to expend vital materials and strategic reserves on strategically meaningless operation. The strategic importance of Kursk for Ukraine was the informational war. The strategic attritional war that Russia is launching at this point is attritional and playing into their strengths of lengthening the front line. A key pitfall is to avoid being dragged into the very same trap that you've set for the enemy, and of course wanting Russia to redeploy forces into here. But we talk about there are two different wars being fought, informational and attritional. Kursk did have some benefits, but I think overall it's still a net negative. If you disregard the propaganda value, as we said, and purely focus on attritional war, I believe Russia actually not mobilising assets to remove the Kursk offensive is actually the correct choice in attritional war, because what you end up with is forces that otherwise you would be fighting down in the south or the east, then being held up in this area, where you, by just the way this pushed in, now surround on three sides, and you have a lot of ISR assets here as well. The red lines, when people normally speak, this is about nuclear forces, and it's somewhat interpreted wrong. The nuclear use case is a threat to the existence of the state of the Russian Federation. And at no point in time was this to the existence of the state. But we have seen things like long-range strikes and some other bits of policy shift primarily due to the Kursk offensive and some of the informational war as well, everything from this push in to then North Koreans. This attack into Kursk, the Ukrainian armed forces denied Russian forces absolute control over how the war would be prosecuted. And Russia had to consider the defence and loss of its own territory. This is all good in the four-dimensional chess game of geopolitics, but Ukraine doesn't appear to have the stamina to stay in the game where Russia has more pieces on the board. So short term, do they have the stamina to do it? Well, obviously they've held it for a number of months, but long term, can they actually maintain this? As we've seen, about 2/3 of this has been returned back under Russian control. But that we know that Russia didn't control all of the battlefield, because there's still an area of Russia occupied. This is hindsight, but the personnel and equipment used in Kursk could have been used to prevent or counter the breach over the Oskil in the Kupiansk direction. As we've seen, we've spoken about one of the best measures to see how short on reserves Ukraine is no crossing of the Oskil should have ever been allowed, and we have seen Russia successfully form a bridgehead over here because they didn't have the reserves to actually then stop this breach. Of course, this is many, many months behind, but it shows the limited reserves, and of course, where a lot of this is up there. It's not uncommon to hear words to the effect of, if only we had another 20,000 guys down in the east, and referring to what is happening in Kursk. Geographic barriers provide both physical and mental lines of demarcation, and it may have been possible to maintain that line with sufficient support. Not doing Kursk would have meant Ukraine is on an entirely defensive footing on Ukrainian ground. Defence might be an easier way to wage war, as offensive action is exponentially more costly, but it would not be able to grab Western donors' attention like the Kursk safari did, which does translate into more material support for Ukraine. As we have spoken about and corrected ourselves on, is that Ukraine's industrial base is information due to being completely reliant on international military support. Ultimately, it feels like a war on uneven ground. Zelensky is prosecuting an informational war, and the Ukrainian armed forces is enabling that effort. Putin is prosecuting a war of gaining ground, utilising attrition and overmatch, which Ukraine doesn't have an answer to this point. And this is something you and I have spoken about a lot recently. It seems like two very different wars going on here, but you can't purely just win a war of information and long-range drone strikes against oil facilities. You are going to have tactical wins as well, especially because Putin is just trying to attrit down as much as possible and lengthen the lines to then thin you out even further and talk of Kursk and Pokrovsk, as we have shown you. Could the same political objectives be made with a raid into Kursk? No. So talking go in, take some area, and then pull back out. Russian volunteers had been conducting punitive raids and even attempting to seize and hold, but they were framed as hopeless renegades, rather than what we now know amounted to a diversionary reconnaissance effort. A lot of this too was to divert so other forces or other DRG elements could move across. A large Ukrainian armed forces raid would have been successful, but politically unsuccessful. The withdrawal would be characterised as an inability to hold anything they seize, and may have both boosted Russian force morale and diminished Western donor confidence. If we see Kursk get pushed out or Ukraine have to withdraw out of here, this is still at risk as well. Although the mainstream media focused massively on Kursk and when it was going positive, and completely ignore now that 2/3 of it has been returned under Russian control. I feel Kursk is a much larger play than just about holding territory to exchange back for Ukrainian lands. I don't think it was a successful gamble, but I try to understand why they made it. And of course, we have seen some positives come as far as long-range strikes, holding some ground here, informational positives. But as far as just launching attritional war, I think it has helped the Russians there. And I don't think it is in, if Russia just go, we do not care about informational war, or we don't even care if more aid goes in, our focus is on thinning out your manpower and attriting them down, this plays into that hand as well. So let's talk about Ukrainian armed forces restructuring. And like I've said, is restructuring during wartime will be very, very hard, especially when you're dealing with units that are highly passionate about their unit, as well as units that are very, very empty as well. I've been through minor restructures, and it is very, difficult. Even moving into a different company in the same battalion can be very hard. So let's have a look over this. And of course, all this is not clear at the moment, but this comes from then, of course, General Sursky, the Commander-in-Chief. He says the situation is difficult. We continue to effectively destroy the enemy's military objects in order to reduce his striking potential. Among the priorities, in particular, the operation in Kursk region, the impact of military objects deep in the aggressor country. So one of the priorities is Kursk still, and striking with these drones deep into Russia too. Although the main efforts are primarily on maintaining the borders and preventing the enemy's advancement. What we see is Russia moving every day though. On the ground, we first saturate with personnel and equipment those units that already lead the defence on the front line. Emphasise the need to improve work towards recruitment and strengthening a psychological resilience of warriors. But to improve this, the biggest things I think is competence and accountability of your command. Measures to adapt newcomers arriving from training centres are being carried out before their engagement in combat missions. We take into account the challenges of the time and work to strengthen the army even in the difficult conditions that have emerged. The reform of the organisational structure of the armed forces is in progress. The implementation of the measures from transition to the core structure has begun. February will be difficult for our troops. The enemy does not reduce the intensity of his attack. So let's have a bit of a dive into this and see what is being reported. And this is from Ukrainian media, that a reform plan will be introduced to transition the Ukrainian army to a corps brigade system. Reported here, an army corps typically consists of several combat divisions and or brigades. In the 90s, the corps within the Ukrainian ground forces were operational tactical units. Reforms in the 2000s and the transformation of divisions into brigades, these corps evolved into high tactical units. Eventually, the Army Corps was fully disbanded and some of their components were reorganised into operational commands. We'll look at what Deep State says and we'll try and get some idea of how this may look. And I'm confused about how this is going to look. The brigade system does mean that this brigade can operate independently and is far more flexible. And from my knowledge of warfare, this is definitely improved structure, at least for speed on the front line. That you don't then just have corps of artillery or infantry or this or that or individual units. You basically, your brigade is its own small little army. So within that, you've got your own infantry, your armoured, your artillery, your transport, all your supporting elements within the brigade. They're not separate. It's all internal. You're basically creating your own little armies. But this is hard to get an idea of exactly how this is going to look. When you're talking core, you're talking large, strategic, and complex for large-scale wartime operations. Your brigades are more small, agile, tactical, operating in one sector at a time. Both systems, though, you need both systems to be complementary to each other because the brigades often serve as building blocks within the corps. And what I'm going to show you is the Australian Army, one brigade, where I served myself, and have a look at the breakdown here, as this is not in my time in the army, but we had restructures to form this over time. So this is the 1st Brigade here, that we have headquarters. Then we have the 5/7th, the infantry unit. We have artillery, we have engineers, signals, so radio operators, everything around this, and then your support as well, which is all your supporting elements, logistics, transport, everything to do with that. Then we can see here, of course, we were attached at one point to an armoured battalion 2 when we were mechanised. There's no mechanised infantry unit in this anymore, but we would have then armoured connected to it if we were mechanised infantry. So what you're looking at here is that it's its own like little army within. Now there's some elements that get attached on, but you're looking at your brigade is under your corps and that's its own small army. You're not relying on other attachments. It's your own little thing. So it's far more flexible at the front. 3rd Brigade, you can have a look here. This is probably a better example of this. This is up in Townsville. So you've got your motorised and mechanised infantry units. That's all in-house, but you can have other drives and stuff attached to this. You've got your artillery, you've got your armoured cavalry, then you have your supporting engineers and signals as well. And then other units that are not part of the actual establishment, but they have to support it, are your aviation and some of these logistics as well. So what I'm trying to show you is these in the core structure here, under one division, these brigades can operate basically independently. And this is why it is much more flexible and faster. Large-scale war, at least our system hasn't been tested on that. But you've got your Army Corps, to the Australian Army Corps, and then brigades underneath this. So you've got these three can operate independently, with these then attached to it as we go. Everything from amphibious task groups to engineer to reserves, everything connected to this as well. So instead of like individual units, you've got individual little armies with subunits within that. So I was in the 7th Battalion Infantry, but part of one brigade. And if we needed artillery, we'd be using our brigade's artillery and would deploy into larger scale, not on, anti-terror operation, but we would be deploying as the brigade itself and everything in-house. Deep State has spoken about this. The reform of the organisational structure of the armed forces is underway. We have begun implementing measures to transition to a core structure. This is stated in the text of the Facebook post from then General Sursky. The last mention of the transition to the core system of the armed forces was in November 24, where by the end of the month they promised to present a concept. But since this news came to the media from anonymous sources within the armed forces, no one took responsibility for this information. Society has long been discussing about the reform of the armed forces, in particular in the field of transformation and army formations, where the main issue is the core management structure and divisional structure. Currently, the Ukrainian army has the following army corps. So you can see broken down into these ground forces, airborne and marines as well. One thing which this could have a byproduct of is actually reducing the amount of command positions and being able to put more competent commanders in and get rid of very incompetent commanders too. That could happen. But how this is going to be implemented is going to be very, very challenging too. It is interesting that even with the existence of corps, these formations are not being used for their intended purpose for the same reason, or such uses were unsuccessful. For example, Krinky, where the Marine Corps was wiped out, the 10th Army Corps, which was wiped out in the summer counteroffensive of 2023. And this corps has never been used in one formation, although it's physically difficult because it includes literally all units of the branch of the army. So all branches in here, one, but you can end up getting this sort of pawned out as well. Today, army corps are being formed on the basis of some brigades, but their structure and final appearance is still unclear. So time will tell what the final conclusion and implementation will reach. You can also observe the expansion of many units of various branches of the armed forces, which are most likely part of the reform. It remains to solve the problems with newly formed brigades, which demonstrate not the best results among others. Constant oatmeal from company tactical groups, where the biggest consequences is losses due to the lack of coordination, replenishment and retention of people in existing brigades. So I don't know how this is going to look, but it's going to be like putting other elements from artillery, mechanised infantry, light infantry, all the way down to logistics under a core structure, which is somewhat existent, but Deep State is talking about the problems here as well. In wartime, especially with like some battalions operating at company minus size, or even platoon size at some of them, it's going to be challenging. I don't see how this is really going to be done at in wartime, because one of the biggest things about having a brigade structure like this, and then what I've seen, is you're always working with the same infantry, the same artillery, the same mechanised, as well as all the training and stuff is done as that small unit too. But we will see. Will it break down like that, or will it look like something completely separate? Again, we will see. So, of course, President Trump overnight has spoken about wanting to have some like trade of resources for military aid, or even payback of military aid too. This is Reuters reporting. Trump says he wants Ukraine to supply US with rare earths. And we have gone over this very recently, and we've spoken about what is underneath where Russia occupy, that there are trillions and trillions of dollars of resources as well as rare earths. And could the US get promised this from Ukraine for further recovery, further aid? What we know is Russia is definitely eyeing some of this for their own post-war attrition economic recovery as well. Trump said on Monday he wants Ukraine to supply the US with rare earth minerals as a form of payment for financially supporting the country's war efforts against Russia. Trump, speaking to reporters at the White House, said Ukraine was willing, adding that he wants equalization from Ukraine for Washington's close to $300 billion in support, so paying some of that back in a way as well. We're telling Ukraine they have very valuable rare earths. We're looking to do a deal with Ukraine where they're going to secure what we're giving them with their rare earths and other things. So we'll give you this system, but we want access to $1 billion worth of this. It was not immediately clear if Trump was using the term rare earths to refer to all types of critical minerals or just rare earth materials. They're a group of 17 metals, things like titanium, lithium. Those are the ones you're probably most familiar with. Ukraine contains large deposits of uranium, lithium, titanium, although none are considered to be among the world's top 5 biggest by volume, and the US has its own untapped reserves of those and other critical minerals, although it may be cheaper to dig these up in Ukraine too. But what we do know is in Ukraine, rare earth mining is relatively undeveloped and is very difficult to extract as well. Even before the war, there was a lot of companies reportedly running at a loss trying to pull these out. The other big thing in this is a lot of these materials, a lot of these resources are in Russian-occupied areas. So we can look at titanium and some areas on the map here. This is by the chairman of the board of Ukrainian Association of Geologists. Again, one thing I'll say about titanium, and we spoke about, titanium has a much larger strategic value than dollar value. Ukraine is one of the few countries in the world where titanium ores is mined. Of course, the massive one being Russia. This is where the deposits are located. Dnipro, Kiev, Kharkiv, and Donetsk. Of course, one of these areas is occupied, or a lot of it is occupied by the Russian forces. Lithium, Ukraine's confirmed reserves of lithium are the largest in Europe, although, again, a lot of these are located in occupied areas. So could there be, we'll give you weapons to push back, but we want the first dibs on this amount of material? We will see. And when we talk lithium, we're seeing this deposit here. Now, some claim it's occupied, some say it's not, but we know it's right near the front line at the moment down in Donetsk at the Shevchenko deposit, and there's 10 million tons of lithium ore here. It's the largest in Ukraine, largest by a long way. I believe the second is only 2 million tons. So this is 5 times larger, but of course, Russia will be looking to occupy areas like this too, if they don't already. And we can see where this deposit is on this map, where other deposits are as well. Experts say Russia's seizure of Ukrainian lithium deposits could impact the rest of Europe and the continent's efforts to shift to green energy. Because, of course, they're not going to be wanting to buy that off Russia. But even if Russia pulls this out of the ground, there may be some problems around reselling it too. But, of course, China, and India, they are not going to give a shit where it came from. But due to sanctions, they may be able to get it cheaper. Trump has said, I want to have security of rare earths. We're putting in hundreds of billions of dollars. They have great rare earths, and I want security of the rare earths, and they are willing to do it. And as we've said, Trump is transactional. If Ukraine can say you will have this amount of it, you may be able to have that transactional approach to more aid or rebuilding or paying back some aid potentially as well. As we know, Trump is concerned about how expensive this war so far has been, and comments made yesterday by Zelensky that we've seen shared by, of course, Musk, who's in Trump's party, or basically within the Republican upper echelon, speaking about there's over $100 billion missing. A source in the president's office familiar with the matter told the Kyiv Independent that sharing Ukrainian resources with allies was part of President Volodymyr Zelensky's victory plan shown to foreign leaders, including Trump. Of course, we haven't heard much about that since, and even at the time, many said the victory plan was very lackluster in general. But for this, Ukraine's security must be guaranteed so that the Russians do not occupy this Ukrainian land with the minerals. They occupy a lot of it now. Of course, there's a lot sitting outside of that too, but we will see. The majority of it, at least if you were to put like the richest in resource oblasts, a lot of those are being occupied by Russia, or percentage occupied by Russia as well. We know Russia will want it. We know other areas around the world, especially those rare earths, are incredibly valuable. So we will see. But this transactional approach, I think, is the best way to approach this with President Trump from President Zelensky is, look, you will be refunded on this. Again, we will see. Legends, have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.